Hi Gateway, welcome back and thanks for joining me today. And today I want to talk to you about how the grace of God forgives us, invites us, and accepts us and loves us, but also how the grace of God directs us and guides us and leads us. And the important thing I want to note is that grace that loves us and accepts us comes first, but the grace of God also guides us and directs us. And the important thing is the order, that we are accepted and loved, and then we're guided and directed, but also that the two are always joined together. Of how in love He forgives us, but also in love He guides us and directs us. So the first thing I say is how the important thing is that we are accepted and loved by His grace. You've probably seen somewhere in your travels at a work site one of those safety signs. You know, it's one of those signs that's posted and it's got like a blank days since last accident. And using that blank, there'll be a number, and ideally the number will be large. So it'll be like 200 days, 300 days since last accident. And the point of that sign is to raise awareness of safety, to promote the value of safety, to say we value your safety here as our workers, and we keep this as a priority, and just aware of how we're doing. And also a little bit of accountability, because no one wants to be that poor guy who makes it go back down to zero. Now, on a work site, that's good and helpful. But in my life sometimes, I tend to think, maybe you have too, that God has over my head a similar sign. But it's not a safety sign, it's a performance sign, a sin sign. Where God has over my head the sign that says blank days since last major sin. And He assesses me and values me on how well I'm doing. And if I'm doing really well, then He's going to hear my prayers, then He's going to speak to me, then great things are going to happen. But if I've had a really bad day or a really bad week, then what's the point in praying? What's the point of reading my Bible? And to be honest, I've struggled with this a lot in my life, where I'll think, man, it's been a bad week. What's the point in praying? God's just going to be angry at me. He's not going to listen to me. What's the point of reading my Bible? He's not going to speak to me. And why bother going to church? He's just going to be an angry God who's just going to judge me, and I'm not good enough to be here. And maybe you've struggled with that as well before in your life. And often the problem with this is it leads to pride or despair. Pride in thinking that I'm good enough now for God, or despair in thinking that I'm never going to be good enough. Or maybe you're a non-religious type, and you're thinking that whole concept is stupid. Why in the world would God care about how I am doing? Why? He's this, if He exists at all, He's this huge being. Why would He care about little old me? Surely it's irrelevant to Him. Now all these views, to make for us as Christians, our understanding of who God is, we want to turn to the Bible. For we believe that God has made Himself known, His existence known in creation, but He's made His character and His will known specifically through Scripture. And the culmination of all this is Christ, and how we know who God is and what He wants for our lives. And so to figure out, okay, what is right? Does God keep a list of sins over my head? Does God care about how I live? What's the answer? We look to the Bible. And so right now we're doing a series going through the Psalms. And the Psalms are these recorded prayers and poetry speaking to God, about God, but it's also it's divinely inspired, and that God speaks to us through this as well. And in the 5th Psalm, there's a verse I want to bring out here. It's verse 7 of Psalm 5. And it speaks of this, of how do we access God? How do we know God? How do we come into His presence, experience His goodness? And he says this. He says, "But as for me, but I, by your abundant loving kindness, I will enter your house." I will enter your house. Back in the day, people would have a special place to experience God's presence. They would build all through the wilderness. They would have special places. Hey, God did something here. Let's meet here and to relish in that experience. And then eventually it came to a one place, the tabernacle, and then the temple. And this And the temple, we know there was a house of God where they said, this is where we are going to gather to experience the presence of God. This is a place on earth that God has chosen to physically manifest his presence. Now, they knew very well that God was not limited to the temple. They knew that he was everywhere. In the prayer dedicating the temple in 1 Kings 8, Solomon, he got down on his knees and raised his hands to heaven and said, God, we know that the highest heavens cannot contain you. Nevertheless, we pray here at this temple. So will you hear from heaven where you live and forgive and answer our prayer? And so when the Bible talks about coming, into your house, it's talking about, being aware of his presence. We're gathering to pray, to learn from you, to hear from you, to speak to you, to worship you, to be forgiven. And he says, I do all of that by your abundant loving kindness. Some translations there have the word grace or mercy or just love. And the reason for all the variations in translations is because the word there in Hebrew is chesed, which is a rich term, which really means all of those things. And there's really no direct English equivalent to it. That's why we've made words like loving kindness. Because how do you encapsulate all that concept into one word? It's the word of how God relates to us by his grace and his mercy and his love and his kindness and his goodness to us. It's all combined together. This is how God treats us. His chesed, his loving kindness. And it is abundant. It is great. It overcomes all kinds of sin. It overcomes all our failures, all our weaknesses. It is a great loving kindness of our God. So it is by his great grace and mercy that we ever experience God, know God, are blessed by his goodness. So any access we have to God is by his divine favor and nothing we have earned. Any acceptance we have by God is by his grace. Any invitation we get from God is by his mercy. It's his grace, not my goodness. And that's the essence of grace. For what grace is, means it is unearned favor, unearned. If you can earn it, it's not grace. It says it's by your grace that I am able to experience your goodness, God. And so like I said, what that means for us is that we need not have any pride. And that's something that church circles wrestle with a lot. Thinking that I'm here because I've cleaned myself up. I'm here because I'm doing good. And as no, there's no place for pride in this, because it's by your grace that we come. But also on the flip side, there's no need to despair or have shame and say, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy. Because his grace is abundant and draws us in. Jesus spoke to this concept of how do we approach God. In Luke chapter 18, he contrasts these two approaches to these two men coming to God. He says one guy who was a Pharisee, he comes to God and he says, God, I thank you that I'm not a cheater, I'm not a sinner, I'm not like those people out there doing bad things, but I tithe, I do these good works. And he gives us this list. And basically he's saying, God, I thank you that I am good enough to stand here before your presence and speak to you. And he says the second man comes to God. He says he couldn't hardly even raise his head to heaven. He was like, I am not worthy. He said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And Jesus says, that first guy who says, here's my track record, he says he was not accepted by God. Because who in their right mind could think that they could stand before a being who simply speaks and creates the universe, and that they could have the credentials to stand before him and say, God, I am worthy to be in your presence? None of us can. And so we don't worry about trying to have a track record of goodness that earns you some special favor, because it's not possible. None of us are worthy to stand before the creator of the universe on our own. What we need is not a track record of goodness, but a track record of humility and repentance, saying, God, you are awesome, you are great. The flip side, we need not despair and say, I'm never going to be good enough, I'm not worthy, because his grace is abundant. Now, the Bible is a piece of literature. I'm asked sometimes, do you take the Bible literally? And I say, yes, I believe the Bible is a piece of literature. That is true. And so what that means is we understand the Bible in context. To get his point here, the context that he's saying here, back up a couple verses. In verse 4, he says, God, you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness, and no evil dwells with you. So he's saying, God, you have nothing to do with anything that's evil. You are only good. You have no part in evil and no fellowship with evil. Indeed, he says in verse 6, you'll destroy all evil. And then comes verse 7. But as for me, but I, the contrast, but I, by your chesed, by your grace, by your loving kindness, I am able to enter your house. And so, even though I might be very aware of sin in my life, of sins that I've done, I need not despair and stay away from God, because his grace is great. It's by his grace that I come. Now, does this mean that it doesn't matter how I live? And the answer is, of course, no. It matters greatly to God how we live. Although he is in the heavens above, and the highest heavens can't contain him, he is still here with us. He still has a plan for our lives and a will for our lives. And so the point here is not that, it's to say that don't think you can earn God's favor by performance, but also don't think that because you've had a bad week that you need to stay away from God. The point is, by grace we are drawn to God, but by his grace we are led by God. And that's why the psalm goes on now. So verse 7 carries on. He says, at your holy temple I will bow down in reverence for you. So at verse 8, O Lord, lead me in your righteousness because of my foes. Make your way straight before me. So he's saying, God, you do have a plan for my life. You do guide me. And so he said some of these words like, I'll bow down in reverence. Bowing down, that's that posture of submission. Say, God, I want to know your will. I want to follow you. And reverence, the word that's sometimes translated fear. It's an I acknowledge your greatness and your superiority. And I am submitting to your will for my life. So yes, God has a plan for us. And we're to come to him saying, God, I want to know your will and do your will. So make your will known to me. Make it plain and straight for me so I can follow. Now, when I was thinking through this, another psalm came to my mind, and that is Psalm 15. And that's a few chapters later. And what that psalm says, it's a psalm that they would recite as they would come up to the temple, come into worship. And it would say, it starts asking the question, who may dwell in the house of the Lord? What kind of person comes before God? And then it gives us a list. And it says things like, he who has a clean hands and a pure heart, he who does not tell lies, he who does not gossip, he who speaks the truth from a sincere heart. And it goes in this list. And I was thinking, does that mean that if you're driving to church or you're walking to church and then you're going through your week and you remember, oh man, I told a lie this week, I better turn around and go home, I'm not qualified? Or does that mean if you're walking to church and you realize, nuts, I listened to that gossip, I better do a U-turn and go home? No, heaven forbid, because none of us would ever make it there. The point is not that if you're coming to church and you realize you have some sin in your life that just turn around and go home, you're not worthy. The point is to realize that when you're coming to God, expect to be changed. The point of like Psalm 15 and others like that are saying that realize that the path in coming to God is simultaneously a path to do his will. That as we come to God, we're saying, God, I am coming to you by your grace, but I'm coming also bowing down to know your will and to do your will for my life. And this is actually a very good thing for us, that his grace accepts us and his grace guides us. If you think of any loving parent, a loving parent accepts a child, forgives a child, loves a child, regardless of what they're doing that week. But a loving parent also will direct and redirect and guide a child. So that's not how you live in this house. No, that's not healthy for you. Don't do that. This is the path to walk. This is how I want you to live your life. Or think back to the illustration of the safety sign. If a safety officer on the work site just said, nuts, back down to 0 again, carry on. Then the next day, nuts, back down to 0 again, carry on. But never address the problem, never fix the problem, he'd be a terrible safety officer. He would say, okay, we're back down to 0. What went wrong? All right, let's fix the problem. Here's how we do it right. Here's how we go on. And that's our God. He says, okay, yes, I forgive you. By grace, I will forgive that. But I want to address the problem. I don't want you to hurt yourself again. I don't want you to, hurt others again. Let's fix the problem. So I'm going to guide you and lead you in your life. And so grace comes first, but grace is never alone. We are come by grace, but we are also directed by grace. It is both. And that's, again, something we struggle with, because the tendency for us is to stress one over the other. We'll stress the mercy of God alone, the love of God alone, and that part alone, or we'll stress the fear alone and the reverence alone. And we harm ourselves to do either one. Or here's why. If you stress just the mercy of God alone and say, well, God is a God of love, so he has no choice but to forgive me, that can lead to thinking that, well, it doesn't matter how I live. It doesn't matter what I do. I can do whatever I want. After all, God's a God of love. He's got to forgive me. It's all going to be good. I do whatever I want. He's going to forgive me. But when we do that, we can just wreck our lives. And we do that, it forgets those verses that say, be holy as I am holy. And that God does have a plan for us and a will for us. On the flip side, if we stress only the fear of God alone and reverence and holiness, it's saying that God's not going to set me no matter what I do. I've got to keep all these sin lists and try and prove that I'm worthy. And that leads to a painful life. You're on this treadmill trying to always earn his favor, but never doing enough. And that theology neglects verses that talk about his love and his grace over us. And so, as Christians, we dwell in the realm of both. In the realm of Chesed, where his love forgives and his love guides. It's this relational love. It's not just abstract out there, but it's with us, accepting us, forgiving us, guiding us, directing us, all together. It is both. Yes, we're aware of our sin, but we are aware of his love and his guidance. There's a famous pastor in New York right now. His name's Timothy Keller. I listen to a lot of his sermons, and he has this line he says in various ways all the time. And he says, the gospel is a message that we are worse sinners than we ever thought possible, but also we are more loved than we ever dared to dream. It is both. It is both. We need guidance because we're sinful people, but we are loved by the grace of God. And so by the mercy of God, we are invited to become, and by his grace, we're also directed. Those aren't contradictory, but they're complementary. And so we want to keep the order right, that we don't earn acceptance, we don't earn his favor, and we keep them together. As far as the order goes, I think of the Ten Commandments. You've probably heard of them before. Do not murder, do not steal. That's those basic rules for living in society. But one of the that begins with the statement where it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of slavery. So the commandments begin with this affirmation that I am your God, you are mine, I have saved you. The first thing you need to know is that I love you, I have saved you, I am yours, and you are mine. And out of that assurance of relationship and love, it says now, here's some house rules. Here's how we live as a family together. We're accepted, and then we're directed. But the two always go together. Once you're accepted, you are expected to be like Christ. You're expected to live in a way that pleases your God. So, who is our God? Our God is a God of grace. We come to him by his grace and by his love. He has invited us by his mercy. We have not earned it, nor are we rejected because of our performance. We are accepted by his grace. Our God is a holy God. And his invitation at the same time is an empowerment for us to become like Christ. And in coming to God, we are accepting his way of life over us and his will for our lives. And so friends, that's a bit of what Psalm 5 teaches us about the grace of God. That in his grace he forgives and he invites and he loves, but in his grace he also guides and leads and directs. Thanks for listening, and may the Lord bless you and keep you this week. Amen.